I used to believe that stability was my role in this family. Not my gift, not my choice, just my assignment. I was the one who paid bills on time, who showed up early, who never asked for help even when I needed it. At 33, I had a solid corporate job, a quiet apartment, and a reputation in my family as the dependable one, the one who would figure it out, the one who would make things work. Dad made decisions. Mom stayed quiet. And my younger sister Rachel was always the priority because she had children. That was the pattern. It had been that way for as long as I could remember. I did not buy my house to run away from them. That is important. I did not do it out of anger or spite. I bought it because I wanted one place in my life that belonged to me without commentary, without opinions, without someone telling me how it could be used better for everyone else. I wanted a front door that I could open and close without feeling like I owed anyone an explanation. I wanted silence that was not heavy. I wanted a space that did not require permission. The house was in Willow Ridge, Oregon, a quiet neighborhood with wide streets and old trees, the kind that looked like they had been standing there long before anyone thought about school rankings or property values. The price was $745,000, which still felt unreal to say out loud even in my own head. It had 4 bedrooms, a backyard that caught the afternoon light, and a school district that people talked about in lowered voices, like it was a secret worth protecting. To me, it felt like a turning point, a line between the life I had been living and the one I wanted. I did not tell my family about it while I was searching. I did not mention the showings, the inspections, the paperwork that piled up on my dining table at night. I told myself it was just until closing, just until everything was final. I wanted to enjoy the idea of it without interference. I wanted to sit with the decision on my own. The day I signed the last document, I sat in my car for a long time afterward, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly, feeling something I had not felt in years, relief. Before I go any further, let me pause for just a moment. If you are listening to this right now, I am curious what you are doing. Are you folding laundry, driving to work, sitting quietly with a cup of coffee? For me, when all of this happened, I was standing in the driveway of a house I thought was finally mine, keys warm in my palm, feeling hopeful in a way that scared me a little. The first time I went to the house alone was supposed to be simple. I had closed a few days earlier and had not moved anything in yet. I told myself I just wanted a few quiet minutes inside, to walk through the rooms, to stand in the kitchen and imagine mornings that did not start with obligation. I parked at the curb and noticed a car I did not recognize in the driveway, then another. My chest tightened, but I brushed it off. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe someone had the wrong address. When I tried the front door, the lock turned too easily. I did not hear silence. My keys were warm in my hand, but the house was already occupied. I heard voices. Laughter. The low, familiar tone of Dad explaining something. I stepped inside slowly, my hand still on the doorknob, and that was when I saw them. Dad was standing in the living room, gesturing toward the windows, talking about natural light. Rachel was there, her husband Mark beside her, and a woman I did not know was walking toward the hallway, nodding thoughtfully. Dad did not stop when he saw me. He smiled the way he always did when he felt in control of a room, and kept talking. He pointed out the size of the bedrooms, the way the floor plan flowed, how the backyard would be perfect for kids. He spoke like someone who had been there before, like someone who belonged there. No one looked surprised to see me. No one paused. It was as if I had simply walked into a conversation already in progress. I stood there for a second longer than was comfortable. I remember noticing the sound of my own breathing, the way the air felt thicker than it should have. Rachel gave me a quick smile, the polite kind, like we had run into each other at a grocery store. Mark nodded. The woman glanced at me and then back at Dad, waiting for him to continue. Dad finally turned to me and said something casual, something about good timing, about how he was just showing them around. My house. The words did not land right away. They floated there, waiting for me to catch up. I did not yell. I did not ask what they were doing there. I did not demand an explanation. I smiled, because that is what I had learned to do when I was confused and outnumbered. I smiled and listened, as Dad talked about how much potential the place had, how it could work so well for everyone. The woman with them listened closely, asking questions about layout and space. She spoke like someone offering opinions, not like a guest. I remember thinking how strange it was that no one asked me how I felt. No one asked if this was what I wanted. It was not malicious, not loud, not dramatic. It was quiet and confident, which somehow made it worse. The assumption was already there. The decision had already been made in their minds. I caught my reflection in the glass of one of the windows, my own face unfamiliar to me at that moment. I looked calm. I looked composed. Inside, something was slipping. Not breaking yet, just shifting. I realized then that whatever privacy I thought I had claimed with that purchase had already dissolved. The secret was gone, and with it, the illusion that this house could exist outside the gravity of my family. Dad kept talking, moving from room to room, describing possibilities. Rachel followed, her eyes scanning the space the way she did when she was imagining furniture. Placement. Mark asked practical questions. The woman scribbled notes in a small notebook. I stayed where I was, my keys still in my hand, wondering how something so carefully planned could unravel so quickly. That was the moment I understood something that had taken me years to articulate. In my family, nothing was ever just mine. Not my time, not my energy, not even my accomplishments. They were resources to be allocated for the greater good as Dad defined it. Standing there, listening to him explain my home to other people as if it were already shared, I felt the weight of that truth settle in my chest. I did not confront him. Not yet. I told myself I needed to understand how this had happened, how they had found out, how far this had already gone. I needed to see the shape of the situation before I reacted, so I stayed quiet. I followed them down the hall. I nodded when someone spoke to me. I played the role I had always played, the one that kept things smooth, even when the ground was shifting under my feet. When they finally paused, standing together in the kitchen, sunlight spilling across the counters I had chosen. Dad looked at me again. He said something about how proud he was, how this place was a good investment. He said it like a conclusion, like the conversation was already complete. I smiled back, feeling something inside me go very still. I realized then that this was not just about a house. It was about boundaries I had never been allowed to have, about choices that were always discussed without me. And as I stood there in the kitchen of the home I had bought in secret, I knew that whatever came next would change things in ways none of us had expected. I stayed where I was, still holding my keys, letting the room settle around me. The light coming through the windows made everything look softer than it felt. I took a breath and forced my voice to sound light, almost playful, and said that I had actually planned to surprise everyone with the house. I said it like it was a funny coincidence, like we had all just arrived at the same place by accident. Then I asked the question that had been pressing against my chest since I walked in. I asked how they even knew about this place. Dad answered right away as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He said that Walter Pierce had called him a few days after closing. Walter was an old friend of his, someone he had worked with years ago, someone who had built that house and loved it. Dad said Walter had been excited, proud even, that his house had gone to someone he knew. He told Dad he had just sold his house to his daughter and hoped she would take care of it the way he always had. Dad shrugged when he told me this, like it explained everything. He said he did not think it was a secret. He said he assumed it was family news. He said it casually, the way people do when they do not expect to be questioned. Something in me tightened at the word assumed. That single word carried so much weight. It told me everything I needed to know about how he saw my life. It was not that he had meant to overstep. It was that the line had never existed for him in the first place. Rachel nodded along as Dad talked, her hands resting on the edge of the kitchen counter. Mark leaned against the wall, listening, his eyes moving around the room. The woman I did not know stepped forward, then smiling politely. Dad introduced her as Denise Holloway. He said she was a friend who had a good eye for layout and space, someone who could give an opinion. The way he said it made it sound like a favor. Denise extended her hand and I shook it. Her grip was firm but brief. She told me the house had great bones, that the flow made sense, that there was a lot of potential. She spoke with confidence, the kind that comes from being used to being invited into other people's decisions. She asked me if I had plans for renovations. I told her I had not gotten that far yet. The conversation moved on without waiting for my answer. Dad began explaining how the rooms could be used differently, how walls could be adjusted if needed. He spoke with authority, drawing on his years in construction, his voice steady and certain. I listened, nodding occasionally, feeling like I was watching someone else's life being planned out in front of me. I realized then that the problem was not Walter calling Dad. Walter had no way of knowing the dynamics in my family. He had simply been proud of the house he was leaving behind. The real issue was what Dad did with that information. He had taken it and acted on it without checking with me, without asking if it was something I wanted to share. I watched Dad move through the space-opening doors, pointing out features, explaining possibilities. He did not do it with malice. He did it with confidence, and that made it harder to interrupt. Confidence has a way of silencing other people, especially when you have been raised to defer to it. I thought about all the other times this had happened, smaller moments that had felt insignificant at the time. Decisions made for me because they seemed logical. Plans discussed around me instead of with me. My needs folded into the larger picture without my consent. I had learned early on that pushing back only made things tense, and tension in our family always landed on Mom. Mom stood near the doorway, quiet as usual. She smiled when someone looked at her, nodded when Dad spoke, but did not add anything. She never did. It was not that she did not have opinions. It was that she had learned when to keep them to herself. Watching her, I felt a familiar mix of affection and sadness. The room felt crowded, even though there were only a few of us. Every sentence added another layer to a plan I had not agreed to. Denise asked if the bedrooms upstairs would be enough. Rachel said it would be perfect, especially for the kids. She mentioned the schools again, how hard it was to find something affordable in a good district. Mark added that interest rates made everything more complicated. Their words overlapped, building momentum. I stood there and let it happen. Part of me wanted to stop them, to say that this was not a group project, that this was my house. But another part of me was still trying to understand how quickly things had shifted. I needed to see how far they were willing to go, what assumptions they had already made. Dad looked at me and asked if I was okay with everyone being there. The question came late, almost as an afterthought. I told him it was fine. My voice sounded calm even to my own ears. He smiled, relieved, and continued. That was when I noticed how comfortable everyone seemed. They spoke freely, moved easily as if the space already belonged to all of us. No one asked if they should leave. No one suggested we talk about it later. The moment had been claimed. I felt a strange detachment settle in. It was not anger yet. It was clear. I saw the pattern laid out plainly, without the emotional fog that usually accompanied family gatherings. Dad received information and acted on it. Rachel adapted her life around the new opportunity. Mark followed the path that seemed most stable. Mom stayed quiet, and I adjusted. I wondered if they realized how much they relied on that adjustment, how often they assumed I would be the one to bend to accommodate, to make things work. Standing there, listening to them talk about my house as if it were a solution waiting to be used, I felt the weight of that expectation. Denise finished her walkthrough and said she could already imagine how it would look once everything was settled. She said it felt like a place meant to be lived in by a family. The word family echoed in my head. I smiled again because that was what I had been trained to do. Dad finally suggested we sit down and talk it through properly. He said there was no rush, that we could take our time. The irony of that was not lost on me. There had already been a rush, just not one that included me. We gathered around the kitchen island. Dad leaned forward, resting his hands on the counter. He looked pleased, energized. He talked about possibilities, about how this could be good for everyone. He said it like a conclusion, not a question. As I listened, I understood something that I had been slow to accept. In my family, boundaries were not discussed because they were not recognized. They were invisible lines that I was expected to manage quietly. And the moment I tried to draw one, it became an inconvenience. I did not say any of this out loud. I let the conversation continue, let the plans take shape. I needed time. I needed space to think. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I reacted. When we finally paused, when the room fell into a brief silence, I felt a deep sense of knowing settle over me. This was not just about how they found out. It was about what they believed they were entitled to once they did. And standing there in the kitchen of the house I had bought for myself, I realized that the idea of privacy had never truly existed in my family. The kitchen slowly became the center of everything. Chairs were pulled closer to the island. Bags were set down. Jackets draped over the backs of stools as if no one planned to leave any time. Soon, the sound of footsteps faded and was replaced by conversation, the kind that grows louder when people start feeling comfortable. I stood near the sink at first. watching everyone settle into a space I had imagined very differently. Dad leaned against the counter and began talking about the layout. He said the square footage was generous, that houses like this were hard to find now, especially in a neighborhood like Willow Ridge. He gestured toward the hallway, explaining how the bedrooms were spaced out well, how the separation made sense for privacy. Mark listened closely, nodding, asking questions about storage and closets. Dad answered without hesitation, drawing on years of experience, his voice steady and assured. Rachel moved closer to the window, peering out at the backyard. She talked about how the kids would love the space, how there was room for a swing set or a small garden. She mentioned the schools again, how the district was known for strong programs and smaller class sizes. She said it would be such a relief not to worry about moving again in a few years, not to have to uproot the kids once they settled in. Mom sat at the edge of the group, hands folded in her lap, listening. She smiled, occasionally murmured agreement when someone looked her way, but did not add much. She rarely did. I had grown up watching her let conversations pass by, choosing peace over participation. Seeing her there now, silent as ever, stirred a familiar ache in my chest. The conversation took on a rhythm, one that did not include me. Dad and Mark talked about the garage, about how much could fit inside, about potential shelving. Rachel chimed in with thoughts about bedrooms, about how one could be a playroom until the kids were older. Denise offered opinions about flow and light, about how the space felt welcoming. They spoke easily, building on one another's ideas, layering possibility on top of possibility. I leaned back against the counter and listened. Every word felt like it moved the house a little further away from me. Not physically, but conceptually. What had been my purchase, my decision, was being reshaped into something communal. A solution. An answer to other people's problems. Dad eventually turned toward me, resting his palms flat on the counter. He looked pleased, energized in a way I recognized. He said that the house could really work for everyone, that it made sense when you thought about it. He said it like he was offering reassurance, like he was easing a concern I had not voiced. That was the moment something shifted inside me. I felt it clearly, like a click. The house was no longer being discussed as my home. It was being discussed as a resource, an asset that could be distributed where it was needed most. And in our family, need has always been defined very narrowly. I thought back to other moments that followed the same pattern. The time I stayed in a job I hated because Dad thought it was stable. The years I put off moving because it would have been inconvenient for family. Gatherings. The countless weekends I spent helping Rachel when the kids were small, canceling my own plans without thinking twice. Each time it seemed reasonable. Each time, I had told myself that being flexible was part of being a good daughter, a good sister. Standing there now, listening to them talk about where furniture might go and how rooms could be repurposed, I felt the weight of all those past decisions. They lined up neatly in my mind, one after another, forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. I had always been the one who made space, the one who adjusted. Mark asked about the size of the primary bedroom, whether it could accommodate a larger bed. Dad answered confidently, saying it was more than enough, that it had been designed with comfort in mind. Rachel smiled, imagining it, already placing herself there in the future she was building in her head. I realized then that no one had asked me what I wanted to do with the primary bedroom. No one had asked how I envisioned living in this house. The assumption was quiet but firm. My plans were secondary. They could be adapted, reshaped, or set aside if necessary. Mom glanced at me briefly, her eyes soft, almost apologetic. It was a look I knew well. A look that said she understood but would not intervene. She had made her choices long ago, choosing harmony over confrontation. I wondered, not for the first time, how many of her own desires she had tucked away to keep things smooth. The talk turned to logistics. Mark mentioned how difficult the market had been, how prices kept climbing, how interest rates made everything feel precarious. Rachel nodded, adding that finding something affordable in a good school district felt nearly impossible. Dad listened, absorbing their concerns, already fitting them into a framework that made sense to him. I could see it forming in his mind, a solution that was efficient, practical, and in his view, generous. He had always prided himself on being the problem solver, the one who could see the bigger picture. And in that picture, my house was a piece that fit too perfectly to be left unused. I said very little. When someone asked me a direct question, I answered politely. keeping my tone neutral. I nodded when appropriate. I smiled when expected. Inside, I was observing, taking note of how easily the narrative had shifted, how quickly something personal had become collective. Denise commented on how rare it was to find a house with so much potential in a neighborhood like this. She said it felt like an opportunity that should not be wasted. The word opportunity hung in the air, heavy with implication. It did not refer to me. It referred to the family as a whole. Dad began outlining possibilities with more certainty, talking about how living together could ease financial pressure, how it could benefit the kids, how it could bring everyone closer. He spoke with conviction, his words flowing smoothly, as if this was a conversation he had already rehearsed. I listened and felt a familiar sense of shrinking, not in confidence but in space. The room felt smaller, the walls closer. I wondered how many times I had stood in kitchens like this one, listening to plans that did not include my needs, telling myself it was temporary, that it was the right thing to do. Rachel looked at me, then her expression hopeful. She said it could be really good for all of us, that it felt like the kind of thing families were supposed to do. There was no malice in her voice, just expectation. I thought about how often the word family had been used to justify decisions. That cost me something: time, energy, freedom. I thought about how easily my independence was treated as optional, something that could be set aside when more pressing needs arose. Dad's voice softened as he talked about the future, about stability, about doing what made sense. He said it like a conclusion, not an invitation. The conversation had reached a point where disagreement would feel disruptive, even selfish. I noticed how comfortable everyone seemed with that, how natural it was for them to assume I would be on board. The idea did not shock them. It did not even surprise them. It was simply the next logical step. I felt a strange calm settle over me, not acceptance but clarity. I saw the situation for what it was, stripped of emotion. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a continuation of a long-established dynamic. The house, my house, had become a family asset in their minds, a solution to a problem they had been trying to solve for a while. And my role, once again, was to make it work. I did not interrupt. I did not argue. I let the conversation play out, watching as plans took shape without my input. I told myself I needed to understand the full scope of what they were, envisioning before I responded. I needed to see how far this would go. When the conversation finally slowed, when voices softened and ideas paused, I remained quiet. I looked around the kitchen at the counters I had chosen, the light I had fallen in love with. I took it all in, not as it was, but as they were beginning to see it. I chose silence not because I agreed, but because I needed time. Time to think. Time to decide what this house would mean in the end. And as I stood there observing rather than participating, I understood that this moment was not about speaking up. It was about paying attention. I stood there a moment longer after the conversation slowed, letting the quiet settle just enough that no one felt rushed. The house felt different now, not empty the way it had earlier, but crowded with expectation. I could sense everyone waiting for me to say something meaningful, something that would move us forward. My silence had weight, and I knew if I did not speak, Dad would fill the space for me. So I did what I had learned to do over the years. I leaned into practicality. I said that if we were even going to consider living together, the house would need work. Not cosmetic changes, not a coat of paint or new furniture, but real adjustments. I mentioned the bedrooms, how they were fine for one person, but would need reworking if more people were involved. I talked about storage, about wear and tear, about how shared spaces always needed more maintenance than anyone expected. I kept my tone neutral, grounded, the way I did at work when outlining potential risks. The reaction was immediate. Dad nodded as if I had confirmed something he already knew. Rachel looked relieved, like I had just acknowledged a problem she was hoping someone else would name. Mark furrowed his brow, thinking through the logistics. Dad said renovations were normal. He said houses like this were meant to be adapted over time. He talked about how solid the structure was, how it could handle changes easily. His voice carried confidence, the kind that made things sound simpler than they ever were. Rachel jumped in then. She said that if changes were needed, they could figure it out. She mentioned their townhouse, how it had served them well but felt cramped now. She talked about the stairs, the lack of space, how the kids were growing fast. Her words tumbled out one after another, carrying a mix of frustration and hope. Mark hesitated. I could see it in his posture, the way he shifted his weight, the way his hands came together and then separated again. He said moving was expensive. He said selling and buying at the same time was stressful. He mentioned the numbers, the uncertainty, the way interest rates made everything feel risky. His concerns were reasonable. They always were. Rachel countered with the school district again. She talked about the programs, the support, how much stability it would give the kids. She said it would be worth it in the long run. Dad listened, his expression thoughtful, already weighing the options. I stayed quiet, letting them talk it through. I did not suggest anything. I did not push the idea forward. I simply added one more practical point when there was a pause. I said that I could not afford renovations on my own. I said it plainly without apology. I said that if changes were needed, the cost would have to be shared. That was all it took. Dad said we would figure it out. He said it confidently, like it was a promise, like it was already decided. He did not ask me what I meant by sharing. He did not ask how much I could contribute. He just assumed there would be a way. Rachel's shoulders relaxed. Mark exhaled slowly. The tension in the room shifted, not disappearing, but settling into something more manageable. A plan or the outline of one began to take shape. They started talking about timelines, about how long renovations might take, about what could be done first and what could wait. Dad talked about contractors he knew, people he trusted. Denise added that doing things sooner rather than later often saved money. The conversation gained momentum, building on itself. I listened and nodded. My face composed, my mind strangely distant. I was not excited. I did not feel relief or anticipation. I felt tired. Not the kind of tiredness that comes from a long day, but the deeper kind. The kind that settles into your bones after years of carrying the same weight. At one point, Dad looked directly at me and asked if this was something I could live with. The question was phrased gently, but the expectation behind it was familiar. I knew what answer would keep things smooth. I knew what answer would avoid conflict, avoid disappointment. I smiled and said maybe it could work. The words came out easily, almost automatically. I did not feel them as I said them. They landed in the room and were immediately accepted. Dad smiled back, satisfied. Rachel looked grateful. Mark nodded, already adjusting his expectations. Inside there was no spark of excitement, no sense of moving forward. Just a quiet acknowledgement that I had stepped into a role I knew too well, the role of the one who makes things possible. The conversation continued, flowing naturally now that agreement had been established. They talked about what selling the townhouse might look like, about timing it right, about coordinating moves. I did not contribute. I watched as they built a future that fit neatly around their needs. Mom remained mostly silent, though she reached out at one point and squeezed my arm gently. It was a small gesture, almost apologetic. I wondered if she recognized what was happening, if she saw the pattern repeating itself, or if, like me for so many years, she had learned to accept it as normal. As the afternoon stretched on, the house felt less like a blank slate and more like a shared project. Every suggestion, every plan layered over the vision I had once held. I tried to remember how it felt that morning, standing alone in the driveway with my keys, feeling hopeful. That feeling seemed distant now, like something I had imagined. Dad talked about how living together could ease pressure on everyone. He said it made sense financially, practically, emotionally. He framed it as a win for the family, a chance to support one another. His words were not cruel. They were sincere. That sincerity made it harder to push back. Rachel talked about how much it would mean to the kids to have grandparents, nearby, to have stability. She talked about holidays, about routines, about growing up in one place. Her voice softened when she spoke about the future, and I could hear how much she wanted this to work. Mark listened occasionally, adding a comment or asking a question, but mostly absorbing what was being decided. I saw the calculation behind his eyes, the balancing of risks and benefits. He was not driven by emotion the way Rachel was. He was driven by necessity. I realized then that no one was acting out of malice. No one was trying to take something from me. They were simply following the path that seemed most logical to them. The problem was that their logic did not include my need for independence. It never had. As the conversation wound down, Dad suggested we all take some time to think about next steps. He said there was no rush, that these things should be done carefully. The irony of that statement did not escape me. The rush had already happened. The decision had already been made in spirit, if not on paper. People began gathering their things. Denise said she would be happy to help with planning if needed. Rachel hugged me, thanking me for being open-minded. Mark shook my hand, his grip firm, his expression earnest. Mom smiled softly, her eyes tired. When they finally left, the house fell quiet again. The silence was heavier this time, filled with echoes of the conversation. I walked through the room, slowly retracing steps that had been taken earlier, touching walls that no longer felt entirely mine. I stood in the kitchen and looked around, imagining what it would look like filled with other people's routines. Toys on the floor, extra dishes in the sink, conversations that did not pause when I entered the room. The image did not fill me with warmth. It filled me with resignation. I realized then that my agreement had not been born out of excitement or hope. It had been born out of habit. The habit of saying yes when saying no felt too disruptive. The habit of prioritizing peace over self-preservation. As I locked the door and stepped outside, the air felt cooler, sharper. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. Somewhere deep down, I knew this was not over. I knew the path we had just stepped onto would lead somewhere difficult. But for now, I had smiled and pretended I agreed. And in doing so, I could feel how far the family was already pushing this forward, carried by momentum I had not created but was expected to sustain. The days that followed did not slow down. If anything, they picked up speed, as if the simple act of saying the idea out loud had given everyone permission to move ahead without hesitation. Dad began calling more often, usually in the early evenings, when he knew I would be done with work. His voice sounded focused and energized, the way it always did when he believed he was solving a problem. He talked through details before I had time to gather my thoughts, outlining steps and timelines as if they had already been agreed upon. He mentioned how quickly Rachel and Mark should list their townhouse, how the market still favored sellers if they acted decisively. He talked about spring being the right time, about curb appeal, about how little fixes could make a big difference. I listened quietly, responding with short acknowledgments, letting him speak. He did not ask for my input. He did not need it. In his mind, the direction was already set. Rachel started texting almost daily. Her messages were longer than usual, filled with questions and updates. She asked about storage space again, about whether the kids could share a room at first, about how soon renovations might start. There was excitement in her words, but also nerves. I could feel her anxiety beneath the surface, the worry that this opportunity might slip away if anything went wrong. Mark reached out too, though less frequently. His messages were practical and cautious. He asked about costs, about timelines, about what would happen if the sale took longer than expected. I could sense the weight he was carrying, the responsibility he felt to make the right decision for his family. When I replied, I kept my tone neutral, reassuring without promising anything concrete. The conversations all had one thing in common. They assumed I was on board, not just emotionally but logistically. The plan moved forward as if my role was already defined, as if my agreement had unlocked the next phase. Dad began talking about how the house could be divided. He mentioned which bedrooms might work best for the kids, how the layout allowed for separation when needed. He talked about the backyard again, about fencing, about how it could be made safer. His voice carried certainty, the same certainty that had guided so many family decisions before. Mom remained mostly in the background. She would occasionally ask how I was doing or remind me to get enough rest. Her concern was gentle, almost careful, as if she did not want to disrupt the flow of things. She did not question the plan. She never did. As the discussions continued, I felt a growing need to step back. The constant communication, the steady forward motion, left me feeling like I was being pulled along rather than choosing a direction. I realized I needed space, not just from the noise, but from the expectations that came with it. I told everyone that I planned to move into a short-term apartment while things were being discussed. I framed it as a practical decision. I said I needed a quiet place to focus on work, that it would make sense not to be in the house while plans were still forming. No one objected. In fact, Dad seemed relieved. It made the situation feel organized, intentional. I found a small apartment a short drive from my office. It was modest, clean, and unremarkable, with neutral walls and simple fixtures. There was nothing about it that invited permanence. That was exactly what I wanted. I signed the lease quickly, feeling a sense of calm as I did. The day I moved in, I carried my bags up the stairs myself. There was no one to comment on where things should go, no one asking questions. I placed my suitcase in the bedroom, set my laptop on the small kitchen table, and stood there for a moment listening. The quiet was immediate and complete. The apartment did not have the warmth or promise of the house in Willow Ridge. It did not feel like a dream or a milestone, but it felt like mine. There was relief in that, a subtle loosening in my chest that surprised me. I had not realized how much tension I had been carrying until it eased. Meanwhile, the plan continued to unfold. Rachel and Mark began preparing their townhouse for sale. They talked about decluttering, about repainting, about small repairs that might help it show better. Rachel sounded hopeful but tense, her emotions swinging between excitement and worry. She talked about memories tied to the house, about how strange it felt to think of leaving. Mark tried to steady her. He pointed out the demand in their area, the fact that they had taken good care of the place. He spoke about numbers, about how the sale could work in their favor if everything lined up. His optimism felt cautious, measured. Dad encouraged them constantly. He offered advice, suggestions, and reassurance. He talked about timing the listing just right, about how these things often worked out when people were willing to act decisively. He sounded confident, convinced that this was the right move. I listened to these conversations from a distance. Sometimes I had them on speakerphones while I sat alone at the small table in my apartment, a mug of tea growing cold beside me. Other times I read messages late at night, the glow of my phone lighting up the quiet room. The separation made everything feel slightly unreal, like I was observing someone else's life rather than my own. In the evenings, I settled into a routine that felt unfamiliar but comforting. I cooked simple meals, often the same few dishes, and ate them slowly. I read in the quiet, took short walks around the neighborhood, and noticed things I usually rushed past. The days felt less crowded, less urgent. I thought about the house often, but not in the way I had expected. Instead of imagining myself there unpacking boxes and settling in, I imagined other people moving through the space. I pictured toys scattered across the floor, conversations overlapping, routines forming that did not include me. The image did not make me angry. It made me tired. At the same time, something else was happening. Without the constant pull of family expectation, I felt lighter. I was not checking my phone as often. I was not anticipating the next request, the next problem to solve. I was simply existing in my own space. Rachel called one afternoon, her voice tight with nerves. She said they were meeting with an agent, that things were moving faster than she had expected. She asked if I was still okay with everything, her tone cautious. I told her I was fine, that I trusted them to make the best decisions for their family. The words came out smoothly even though they felt distant. Later that day, Mark sent me a message thanking me for being flexible. He said it meant a lot to them, especially with everything feeling uncertain. I stared at the message longer than I meant to before replying. I wrote back something polite and supportive. It felt like the only response available to me. Dad continued to speak with certainty. He talked about renovation timelines, about which changes should come first. He spoke as if the outcome was inevitable, as if all that remained was execution. His confidence did not waver. Life in the apartment settled into a quiet rhythm. Mornings were calm. I drank my coffee slowly, watched the light shift across the floor. Evenings were mine. I did not feel rushed to explain where I had been or what I was doing. The simplicity was grounding in a way I had not anticipated. I began to notice how much energy I had been spending for years managing other people's expectations. Without that constant effort, my thoughts felt clearer. I could hear myself think. I could feel what I wanted, even if I did not yet know what I would do with that awareness. The family believed everything was moving in the right direction. The plan was progressing just as Dad had envisioned. From their perspective, things were falling into place. There was no sense of urgency on my end, no need to intervene. I let them move forward, observing quietly from the sidelines. One evening, as I sat alone at the small table in my apartment, something clicked. I realized that for the first time in a very long while, I did not feel responsible for the outcome of anyone else's choices. The weight that had always settled on my shoulders was absent. The feeling was subtle but unmistakable, a quiet sense of autonomy. It did not come with fireworks or certainty. It simply existed, steady and calm. I did not rush to name it or analyze it. I just let it be. As the days passed and the plan continued without me at its center, I found myself breathing more easily. Whatever was coming next, I knew one thing with certainty. I was no longer carrying the burden alone. And that realization, more than anything else, marked a shift I could not undo. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Rachel called me. her voice bright in a way that immediately told me the news before she even said the words. She did not ease into it. She did not soften it. She said the townhouse had sold. Just like that. She sounded relieved, almost breathless, as if she had been holding her breath for weeks and could finally let it out. She told me they had accepted an offer faster than expected. She said the buyers were eager, that everything had lined up better than she had hoped. As she spoke, I could hear papers shuffling in the background, the low murmur of Mark's voice, the sound of movement. Their life was already shifting forward. I congratulated her. The words came out naturally without effort. Part of me was genuinely glad that something had worked out for them. Another part of me felt very far away from the moment, like I was watching it through glass. Rachel went on to explain the numbers. She talked about the mortgage, about fees and costs. She said that after everything was settled, the amount left was not as much as they once imagined, but it was enough. Enough to contribute to the renovations, enough to make the plan feasible. She said it with a hint of relief, like that detail mattered more than anything else. When Dad called later that evening, he sounded triumphant. He said everything had fallen into place. He said this was proof that the plan had been the right one all along. His voice carried that familiar tone of validation, the satisfaction of seeing events unfold exactly as he had predicted. He talked about next steps right away. He said we should start thinking about dates, about how to coordinate everything smoothly. He suggested a moving day that was soon enough to keep momentum, but far enough out to allow for preparation. He said it like it was already decided. I listened quietly, my phone pressed against my ear, sitting alone in my apartment. Outside, the evening light was fading, the street below growing quieter. Inside, Dad's voice filled the space, steady and confident, outlining a future that no longer felt abstract. Rachel texted afterward with more details. She talked about packing, about how strange it felt to sort through years of their life. She mentioned the kids, how they were excited but confused, how she kept telling them everything would be better soon. Her messages were long and emotional, filled with nervous energy. Mark sent a shorter message, more restrained. He said the sale was finalized. He said they were ready to move forward. He thanked me again for being understanding. His words were careful, polite, weighted with responsibility. The family treated the sale like a final piece clicking into place. With that one event, the plan seemed to shift from discussion to certainty. Conversations became more concrete. Dates were mentioned. Timelines were set. Dad talked about contractors again. He mentioned who could start first, what changes were most urgent. He spoke about budgets, about how the funds from the sale could be allocated. He did not ask me when I would need the money transferred. He assumed there would be a time for that. There was an unspoken expectation that everything was ready. All that remained was coordination. I stayed deliberately out of those details. I did not ask to see numbers. I did not offer to handle paperwork. I did not suggest opening a joint account or signing anything. When money was mentioned, I kept my responses vague. I said we could talk about it later. I said there was no rush. No one seemed to notice my distance. Or if they did, they interpreted it as trust. Mom called one morning to check in. She asked how I was doing, whether the apartment was comfortable. Her voice carried concern but also relief. She said it was nice that everything was coming together, that families were meant to support each other in times like this. I told her I was fine. I told her the apartment was quiet, that I was managing. She sounded reassured by that. It seemed to confirm that I was handling my part, whatever that part was assumed to be. As the days passed, the idea of a moving day solidified. Rachel talked about scheduling the movers. Dad suggested a date that worked for everyone. It was written down, referenced, treated as fixed. I noticed something strange during that time. No one asked me to sign anything. No one asked me to transfer ownership or add names. There were no documents exchanged, no formal agreements. Everything existed in conversation, in assumption. It was as if the certainty of family was considered enough. That realization stayed with me. It was subtle but important. I did not receive any money from the sale. I did not ask for it. No checks were written, no transfers made. It was understood, apparently, that the funds would be used when the time came. I did not correct that understanding. In my apartment, life continued quietly. I went to work, came home, and cooked simple meals. The outside world felt unchanged, even as my family's plans accelerated. There was a disconnect between my calm routine and the intensity of their preparations. I thought about the house often during that period, but my thoughts had shifted. I no longer imagined it as my future home. I imagined it as a stage, a place where a story was unfolding without me at the center. Dad called again one evening to go over details. He said he was proud of how everyone had handled things. He said this was what families did when they worked together. His words were warm, satisfied. I agreed politely. I did not argue. There was no need. Rachel sent photos of boxes stacked in their living room, of items labeled and sorted. She said it felt overwhelming but exciting. She said she was ready for the next chapter. Her optimism was real, and it made everything feel heavier. Mark remained practical, focused on logistics. He talked about coordinating schedules, about minimizing disruption for the kids. He seemed relieved to have a clear path forward. From their perspective, the uncertainty was over. The biggest hurdle had been crossed. The rest was just execution. From mine, something felt eerily quiet. There was a stillness beneath the surface, a pause that felt unnatural given how much movement there was around me. I noticed how little was being asked of me directly, how much was being assumed instead. I spent one evening sitting on the floor of my apartment, my back against the couch, listening to the hum of the building. I thought about how quickly things had progressed, how a single purchase had turned into a collective plan without ever being fully discussed. I did not feel panic. I did not feel anger. I felt observant, detached, like someone standing just outside the circle watching carefully. The moving date drew closer. It was mentioned casually now, like an appointment everyone had already accepted. Dad talked about being there early that morning to help. Mom talked about cooking something simple for everyone once they settled in. No one asked me where I would be that day. That detail stood out to me more than anything else. The absence of expectation felt intentional, even if no one had said it out loud. It was assumed that I would fall into place when needed. I did not correct that assumption. As the plan reached what everyone believed was its final stage, the house in Willow Ridge sat quietly empty and waiting. From the outside, it looked the same as it always had. Inside, it held the weight of decisions that had been made without my consent. There was a strange calm in knowing that everything appeared ready, that all the pieces, at least in their minds, were aligned. The quiet before what they thought would be a beginning felt heavy, almost deceptive. I went to bed that night aware of how still everything felt. A stillness that did not signal peace but pause. The kind that comes just before something changes. I woke up the next morning with that same stillness sitting in my chest, like I had swallowed a stone in my sleep, and it had settled behind my ribs. Outside my apartment window, the sky was a pale gray, the kind that makes everything look clean and unfinished. I made coffee, stood barefoot on the kitchen tile, and tried to picture what the next week would look like. All I could see was motion. Boxes, voices. My phone is buzzing with updates. A moving truck pulling up to the driveway in Willow Ridge. Dad was standing there with his hands on his hips like a foreman, directing the whole thing. Rachel carries a bag of snacks and a stack of kid backpacks, trying to keep everyone cheerful. Mark hauled something heavy and told himself this was temporary. This was smart. This was for the kids. And me. I tried to place myself in that picture and realized I was not in it as a person. I was in it as a space, a resource, a solution. I kept thinking about the way Dad had walked through my house that first day, pointing out rooms like he had built them with his own hands. The way Rachel had already started talking about schools and routines. The way Mark had calculated costs like a spreadsheet. None of that was evil. None of it was loud or cruel. It was worse than that. It was normal to them. It was just how our family worked. I sat on the edge of the couch with my coffee and forced myself to imagine the daily reality of it. The front door opened and shut all day. Kids running down the hall laughing, then crying, then laughing again. A television in the living room that I could not turn off without being the villain. Rachel in the kitchen making dinner, asking if I could watch the kids for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. And those 10 minutes turning into an hour, then an evening, then a pattern. Mark taking work calls in what used to be my quiet space, talking in that low, serious voice he used when he wanted to sound in control. Dad was sitting at my table in the mornings reading something on his phone, commenting on how I stocked my fridge, how I spent my money, how I arranged my life. Mom in the background washing dishes, moving softly, avoiding conflict the way she always did. If I pushed back, if I asked for quiet, if I wanted a boundary, Mom would look at me with that pleading expression and say, "We are just trying to keep the peace." I imagined myself coming home from a long day and realizing there was no place to take my shoes off and breathe. I would walk into my own house and feel like a guest who needed permission to exist. And then I pictured something that made my stomach tighten. A few months in, Rachel would say, "The kids are finally settled. It would be cruel to move them again." Dad would say, "We cannot disrupt them now." Mark would talk about finances, about how expensive it would be to change plans. Everything would be framed as practical and compassionate. And if I hesitated, if I tried to reclaim my own home, I would become the selfish one, the cold one, the sister who cared more about walls than family. I knew that script. I had lived versions of it my whole life. I set my mug down and stared at my hands. They were steady. That surprised me. I felt tired, yes, but not panicked. It was a calm, clear exhaustion, like my body had stopped wasting energy on denial. Later that morning, I went into the office, mostly because staying in the apartment felt like sitting in a waiting room. Work had always been the one place where my effort actually belonged to me. I walked through the lobby, nodded at the receptionist, rode the elevator up, and tried to slide back into my usual rhythm. But even there, the thought of moving day hovered, like a calendar notification I could not swipe away. Around mid-afternoon, my boss asked if I had a minute. Her name was Meredith Callow, and she had the kind of calm authority that made people straighten up without realizing it. Meredith had never been warm in a personal way, but she was fair, and she noticed things. She had watched me carry projects that should have been handled by 3 people. She had watched me stay late, fix problems quietly, and never ask for praise. I followed her into her office. The door closed with a soft click behind me, and for a moment I wondered if this was about my performance, about my focus, about the way I had been slightly distracted lately. I braced myself without wanting to. Meredith gestured for me to sit. She sat across from me, hands folded, expression neutral. Then she said something that made my entire body go still. She said she was putting me in for a big promotion. Not a title bump, not a token raise, a real promotion. A role that would put me on a track I had been quietly working toward for years. It would mean more responsibility, more visibility, and yes, more money. But what hit me first was not the salary. It was the recognition. The fact that someone saw my work and valued it without asking me to sacrifice myself to earn it. I felt heat rise behind my eyes and I blinked fast, forcing myself to stay composed. I thanked her. My voice sounded steady, but inside I felt like something cracked open. Meredith continued, still calm, still businesslike. She said there was one thing I needed to know before we moved forward. The company was expanding a partnership overseas. They needed someone reliable, someone who could handle pressure, someone who could represent them well. And the position would likely require relocation to England for around 2 years. The word England landed like a weight. I nodded slowly, trying to process. Meredith explained that it would not be immediate. There would be planning, preparation, and training. But if I accepted the role, I needed to be open to it. I needed to be willing to go when the time came. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. It was not fear, it was something sharper, a sudden awareness of how my future might be opening up, while my personal life was quietly closing in. I told Meredith I was honored. I told her I wanted the opportunity, and I meant it. I had worked too hard to pretend I did not want more. Meredith studied me for a moment as if measuring whether I was serious. Then she nodded and said she would send details soon. She said she believed I could handle it. When I left her office, I walked back to my desk in a daze. My coworkers typed, laughed softly, moved through their routines like nothing had changed. But everything had changed for me, because the moment Meredith said England, my mind jumped ahead. 2 years away. 2 years while my family lived in my house. I pictured myself boarding a plane leaving Oregon behind, telling myself I would come back to my home. But I knew what would happen in reality. While I was gone, the house would stop feeling like mine. They would paint walls, rearrange rooms, plant things in the yard, settle in so deeply that my return would feel like an invasion. Rachel would say the kids have lived here for 2 years. Dad would say you chose to leave. Mark would talk about stability. Mom would ask me not to make things hard. And if I tried to claim the house back then after 2 years, I would not just be selfish, I would be heartless. Even if my name was the only one on the paperwork, even if I had paid for every inch of it, the reality would be different. Reality in my family had never been defined by legality. It was defined by who needed something most, who was loudest, who could make you feel guilty enough to surrender. I sat down at my desk and stared at my computer screen without seeing it. The promotion was everything I had wanted. It was proof that my life could expand beyond my family, beyond their needs. But it also came with a warning. If I did not handle the situation now, I would lose not just my house, but my future, because I could not go to England carrying the fear that I was abandoning my own home to people who would never give it back. I could not build a career on the other side of the ocean while my family rooted themselves into my life like they owned it. I tried to tell myself I could set boundaries. I could put things in writing. I could make a formal agreement. I could do all the rational things. But I knew my family. They did not respect rationality. They respected pressure. They respected leverage. They respected what they could take and keep. That evening, I drove to Willow Ridge alone. I did not tell anyone I was going. I just needed to see the house with my own eyes, to remember what it had felt like before it became a family plan. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that had first made me fall in love with it. Trees lining the street porch lights starting to glow as the sun lowered. It looked like safety. It looked like my turning point. I parked and sat in the car for a long minute, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. Then I walked up to the front door and unlocked it. The air inside was still, empty, clean. It smelled faintly like fresh paint and new wood, that subtle scent of a place that has not yet absorbed anyone's life. I walked through the room slowly. I stood in the kitchen and imagined it full. I stood in the living room and imagined the couch Rachel wanted, the way Dad would sit and take up space. I walked down the hallway and pictured kids' rooms, Dad claiming the guest room, Mom quietly making herself useful. I went into the primary bedroom and closed the door behind me. The silence in there was thick and soft like a blanket. I leaned my back against the wall and finally let myself feel it. Grief. Not grief over losing a house. Grief over realizing I had never been allowed to have something that was only mine, even when I bought it, even when I did everything right, even when I tried to keep it private to protect it. Because the truth was, my family did not see my independence as real. They saw it as temporary. They saw my boundaries as suggestions. They saw my achievements as community property. And standing there in that empty room, I realized something with a clarity that almost made me dizzy. If I let them move in, and if I left for England while they lived there, I would come back to a house that was technically mine but emotionally occupied. I would lose everything. The peace I had wanted, the future I was building, the chance to live like a person instead of a solution. I opened my eyes and looked around the room again. The walls were blank. The floor was clean. The space still belonged to possibility. And that was when the decision formed, like a burst of anger, but like a quiet door closing. I was not going to fight them inside that house. I was not going to spend months or years trying to reclaim space that should have been mine from the start. I was not going to let them anchor themselves into my life and call it family. I pulled my phone out and stared at the screen. My hands were still steady. That steadiness felt like power. The decision was not revenge. Not yet. It was self-preservation. I walked back into the kitchen, sat at the counter, and listened to the silence. I let it sink into my skin, memorizing it. Then I locked the door behind me, and stepped back into the cool evening air. As I drove away, I did not call Dad. I did not text Rachel. I did not warn anyone. I kept my face calm, my thoughts quiet, and I carried my decision like a secret I was finally allowed to keep. By the time I reached my apartment, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I just did not say it out loud yet. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. The way you do when a decision has already been made somewhere deep in your body. My apartment was still dark, the air cool, the street outside quiet. I lay there for a moment listening to my own breathing, waiting for the guilt to arrive, waiting for the panic, waiting for the part of me that always tried to keep the peace to start. Bargaining. None of it came. What I felt was clarity. Not excitement, not anger. Just a clean, steady certainty, like a line had finally been drawn, and I was standing on the right side of it. I made coffee, sat at the little table, and opened my laptop. My fingers did not shake. My thoughts did not scatter. I worked through the steps the same way I worked through a hard problem at the office, quietly, methodically, without drama. I started with my real estate attorney. The one I had hired when I bought the place. The one who had helped me keep my name off as much paperwork as possible while staying completely legal. I called her office as soon as they opened, and when she answered, I kept my voice calm. I told her I wanted to sell the house. There was a pause. Not judgment, just a surprise. She asked if something had changed. I said yes and left it at that. She did not push. She simply shifted into work mode and asked what timeline I had in mind. As soon as possible, I told her. I could almost hear her calculating. She explained what a fast sale would look like, what it would require, what the risks were. She asked if the house had ever been occupied. I said no. I told her it was essentially untouched. I told her I had not even moved in. She said that could help. In a market like ours, a clean property with no wear and tear could move quickly if it was priced. Right and staged, well staged. The word would have made me laugh a month earlier. Now it just sounded like strategy. I contacted a realtor next. Not someone connected to Dad, not someone from the same social circle, not anyone my family could casually charm or pressure. I picked someone recommended by a colleague from work, a woman who sounded direct and unbothered, the kind of person who did not care about family feelings. She cared about contracts and deadlines. When we met, I did not tell her my whole story. I did not need to. I told her I had purchased the house as a personal move. Then my circumstances changed. I told her I needed it sold quickly and cleanly. She asked what I meant by cleanliness. I told her I meant no loose ends, no delays, no drama, just a proper transaction. She nodded like she understood that on a deeper level than I had set out. Loud. We walked through the house together that afternoon. The sun came in through the windows and made everything look warm and hopeful. Like life was supposed to start there. My realtor talked about the bones of the place, the finishes, the school district, the neighborhood. She pointed out selling points the way Dad had, but there was a difference. She was not claiming it. She was evaluating it. She asked if I had any emotional attachment to the home. I almost smiled. I told her not anymore. We ran numbers. She explained pricing strategy, how to attract the right kind of buyer fast without looking desperate. She suggested a pre-listing inspection to reduce surprises, a light staging package to make it feel lived in without being personal. She said if I was willing to move quickly, we could list within days. I told her I was. By the end of that first day, the wheel was already turning. Paperwork was being drafted. Photos were scheduled. An inspector was booked. A stage was lined up. Everything was happening in a quiet, professional rhythm that felt almost soothing. That night, I sat on my couch in my apartment and stared at the ceiling. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel about moving boxes. Another message from Dad about the schedule. Mom sent a short note asking if I was eating enough. I did not reply right away. Not because I was being cruel, but because I needed to keep my mind clear. If I engaged too soon, I would get pulled back into the emotional current. The one that always swept me into explaining myself, softening my boundaries, making room for everyone else. I was done making room. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet action. The house was photographed. It looked beautiful in pictures like a magazine spread, the kind of place people daydream about on their lunch break. The realtor posted the listing. My attorney prepared everything to be ready for an offer. I kept going to work as if nothing was happening, though inside I felt like I was walking around with a secret that weighed, nothing and everything at the same time. At home, my family kept planning. Rachel called me one evening excited, asking if I thought they should rent a storage unit or just keep everything packed. She asked about paint colors again. She asked about whether the kids should get bunk beds or separate beds in the new rooms. Her voice had that bright, hopeful edge that comes when someone believes they are finally moving toward stability. I listened. I made supportive sounds. I told her I trusted her instincts. I did not correct her. Not yet. After I hung up, I sat very still and let myself feel the part that hurt. Because it did hurt. Not in a guilty way, but in a human way. Rachel was my little sister. She was not a monster. She was a woman trying to make life work in a world that had become expensive and uncertain. She wanted good schools for her kids. She wanted a yard. She wanted breathing room. Those desires were not wrong. What was wrong was that she was building that dream on top of my life without ever asking what it would cost me. And Dad. Dad was not packing boxes or worrying about school lunches. Dad was running the show the way he always had. deciding what was best for everyone, then expecting the rest of us to fall into place. He believed the house had become a family solution the moment he heard about it. He believed my purchase had been an opportunity for him to manage. I had spent my whole life trying to earn a kind of respect from Dad that never arrived. I had tried to be responsible enough, helpful enough, quiet enough, to be seen as more than a tool. Standing back now, watching him organize my future like a project plan, I finally understood something that should have been obvious years ago. In Dad's eyes, I was not a person with a life. I was a resource with a schedule. The first offer came quickly. My realtor called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was at my desk. She spoke softly, professionally, and told me the offer was strong. It was not a lowball. It was not a time-wasting offer. It was serious. The buyer had already been pre-approved. They wanted a fast close. I closed my laptop halfway, breathing carefully, and asked for details. My realtor walked me through the terms, the timeline, the contingencies, the earnest money, the buyer's flexibility. It was all clean, almost too clean, like the universe was making room for me to step out of a trap. I asked my attorney to review it. She called me later and said it looked solid. She said if I wanted to accept, we could move fast. I accepted. I signed documents electronically that night, sitting at my apartment table with my hair still damp from a shower, wearing an old sweatshirt. The simplicity of it felt almost surreal. No confrontation, no yelling, no family meeting. Just a few clicks, a couple signatures, and a decision becoming reality. The next day, the buyer scheduled an inspection. It went smoothly. The house was in excellent shape. It had barely been touched. The buyer asked for minor things. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would slow the process. Meanwhile, the moving day was getting closer in my family's world. Dad called again, talking about the truck. He mentioned how Mark had found a good moving company. He said the schedule looked perfect. He told me he was proud of how everyone was working together. I kept my voice even. I told him that sounded fine. I did not argue. I did not confess. I let him keep believing what he wanted to believe. After the call ended, I sat in silence and felt a strange heaviness. No regret, not fear. Just the awareness that I was about to change the entire dynamic of my family, whether they understood it or not. That weekend, I drove back to Willow Ridge one more time. Not for a meeting, not to see my family, just to stand in the empty house while it was still technically mine. I walked through it slowly. The rooms echoed. The floors creaked softly under my steps. Sunlight stretched across the walls. I stood in the kitchen and imagined how it would have looked, filled with my family's voices, their routines, their chaos. Then I imagined something else. I imagined myself in England, thousands of miles away, trying to build a career while worrying about what was happening in my own house. I imagined myself coming back after 2 years and finding my space fully occupied, my life rearranged, my autonomy gone. That image made my throat tighten. I walked into the primary bedroom again and stood there, breathing in the scent of newness. I whispered to myself that this house was not a failure. Buying it had not been a mistake. The mistake would have been letting it become a cage. I locked the door behind me when I left, and for the first time, the click of the lock did not feel like protection. It felt like closure. The closing process moved faster than I expected. The buyer's lender was responsive. Paperwork flowed. Every time my phone buzzed with an email notification, it was another piece of the transaction sliding into place. I did not tell my family. Not because I wanted to hurt them. Not because I wanted to shock them. But because I had learned something crucial about my family. If I announced my plan, they would scramble. They would pressure me. They would guilt me. They would try to negotiate. They would try to make me feel cruel enough to back down. I did not owe them a debate. I did not owe them a vote. They had never treated my choices like mine. They had treated them like invitations. And I had never offered this one. The day before the scheduled move, my realtor called and said we were clear to close. Everything was ready. The funds would be wired. The deed would record. The buyer would take possession. I sat there, phone in hand, listening to her calm voice, and felt a wave of something I had not expected. Relief. Deep relief. The kind that makes you realize how long you have been holding your breath. That evening, I packed a small bag, not because I was running away, but because I was stepping out of the script my family had written for me. I changed my phone settings. I silenced notifications from the group chat. I forwarded my mail. I made sure my apartment lease was extended just enough. Everything I did was quiet, practical, final. When I turned off the lights that night, I did not feel like a woman plotting revenge. I felt like a woman finally choosing her own life. And in the darkness, with nothing but the hum of the apartment building around me, I realized that for the first time in years, I could imagine a future that did not include my family's hands on the steering wheel. I fell asleep knowing that by tomorrow, I would no longer be part of their plan at all. I woke up to a string of vibrations on my nightstand, my phone rattling against the wood like it was trying to jump off. For a split second, my body reacted the old way. A spike of dread, the instinct to grab it and fix whatever emergency was happening. Then I remembered, and instead of dread, I felt a strange calm. I rolled onto my back and stared at the ceiling. The light coming through the blinds was thin and pale. Somewhere in the building, a neighbor started their shower. Ordinary life was going on while my family was about to collide with reality. My phone lit up again. Dad, then Rachel, then Dad again. Then a number I did not recognize, but I knew it had to be Mark. I let it ring, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I had learned that if I answered, I would get pulled back into the same pattern. Their voices would fill my ear. Their panic would become my responsibility. Their frustration would turn into pressure. And I would start explaining myself, defending myself, softening the edges. I was done softening. I sat up slowly, swung my feet onto the floor, and walked to the window. From my apartment, you could not see Willow Ridge, but in my mind, I could see it clearly like a live camera feed. I could see the street, the neat yards, the quiet driveways, the kind of neighborhood where people notice things. I pictured the moving truck turning the corner and lumbering down the road, with its big white sides and blinking lights. I pictured Dad's car behind it, Dad driving with that confident posture like he was escorting a parade. I pictured Rachel's car packed with bags and snacks and last-minute essentials, the kids in the back seat probably bouncing with excitement. They were going to pull up to the driveway expecting a new chapter. Instead, they were about to meet a locked door. I walked back to the kitchen and poured myself coffee. My hands were steady. I took a sip and waited. The first voicemail came through a minute later. Dad's voice clipped and irritated, trying to stay in control. Claire, call me. We are here. The truck is here. The house is locked. I set the phone down and waited again. A second voicemail. Rachel, her voice already shaking. Claire, are you inside? Please pick up. The movers are here and the kids are freaking out. Then Mark's text popped up. We are at the house. The door is locked. Please respond. I stared at the words for a long moment. I could almost hear his tone. Mark was not dramatic. Mark was a man who tried to solve things quietly. He had probably assumed this was a misunderstanding, a technical issue. Maybe the smart lock had glitched. Maybe I was sleeping. Maybe I had stepped out and would be back any minute. The truth was going to hit him like cold water. The calls kept coming. I watched the screen light up, then go dark, then light up again. The old version of me would have been sweating, heart racing, trying to figure out how to make this go smoothly. But I was not trying to make it smooth, because they had not offered me a smoothie. They had offered me to be swallowed. After about 20 minutes, Dad called again. I let it ring out. Then he texted, "Stop playing games. Open the door." The words made my stomach twist, not because I felt guilty, but because they sounded exactly like him. The assumption that I was misbehaving. The assumption that I owed him compliance. Even now, with everything on the line, his first instinct was not concerned. It was controlled. Another text from Rachel. Dad says the lock must have been changed. Did you change it? Did something happen? Please. I could almost see her standing on the porch, hugging herself, eyes wide, trying to keep the kids calm. I could see Dad pulling on the handle like if he yanked hard enough, the world would bend to his will. I could see Mark standing a step back, watching the scene with that tight expression he got when he felt trapped. And then there was Denise Holloway. I pictured her too because I knew she would be there. Denise with her lipstick and her fake helpful tone, standing slightly off to the side like she was an observer at a social experiment. She probably had her phone in her hand already, ready to text someone, ready to spin it. I took another sip of coffee and forced myself to breathe. I did not want to enjoy their panic. I wanted to be free. But I could not pretend a part of me did not feel a sharp satisfaction that For once, my family was the one standing outside, confused, powerless, waiting for someone else to make a decision. Because that was how I had lived for years. Standing outside my own life, waiting for Dad to decide what was reasonable, waiting for Rachel's needs to become the priority, waiting for Mom to quietly signal what I should do to keep the peace. Now it was their turn to wait. I sat down at the table and finally picked up my phone. Not to answer. Just to check the time. In my mind, moving days had always been scheduled like a performance. A morning of hustle, then pizza on the floor, then Dad making a speech about family. Instead, it was going to be a morning of silence. Another voicemail came in. Dad again, and this one had a different edge. Claire, if you do not answer right now, I am calling a locksmith. This is ridiculous. I almost laughed, not out loud. Just a breath of disbelief. A locksmith, of course. Dad's answer to a locked door was always to find someone else with tools to override it. He still believed the house was mine, which meant in his mind it was still within his reach. I imagined him making the call. I imagined the locksmith asking for proof of ownership. Dad would probably puff up and say, "It is my daughter's house. We are moving in today. She must have accidentally locked us out." The locksmith would ask for ID. Dad would flash his license like that meant something. The locksmith would ask for paperwork, a deed, something official. And Dad would realize he did not have any of it, because it had never occurred to him that he would need permission. He had operated on entitlement for so long he thought it counted as documentation. As the morning stretched on, I started receiving new kinds of messages, not just calls. Photos. Rachel sent a picture of the moving truck parked near the curb, the driver standing with his arms crossed. You could see Dad in the background, mid-gesture, probably explaining, probably arguing. Rachel texted, "The driver says he is charging by the hour. Dad is yelling at him. Please." Then Mark's message, "Neighbors are watching. Please just call." That one hit a different spot. Because Mark was right. Neighbors were watching. Willow Ridge was quiet. And a moving truck sitting idle in a driveway was the kind of thing that drew curtains back. People with coffee mugs in their hands. People with dogs pausing on walks. People glancing over like, what is going on over there? I pictured Brenda across the street, the woman who had welcomed me when I first arrived, who had asked if I was flipping the place. Brenda would be watching now too. And Denise would notice Brenda noticing. Dad would notice Denise noticing. Rachel would notice everyone noticing. My family cared about appearances the way some people cared about oxygen. Dad could handle conflict behind closed doors, but public confusion, public embarrassment that made him spiral. I watched my phone light up again. This time it was Mom. I stared at her name on the screen for a long moment. Mom never called unless something was truly happening. Mom avoided direct confrontation like it was a live wire. If she was calling now, it meant she was being pushed. Dad was probably barking orders. Rachel was probably crying. And Mom was being asked to fix it. I let it ring out. I felt a tightness in my throat, a sting behind my eyes, but I did not move. I did not answer. Because if I answered Mom, I would hear that soft tone she used when she wanted me to surrender. She would say, "Claire, honey, please, you are making this so hard. Just talk to your dad. Just help your sister, we can work it out." Work it out. The phrase that always meant I would give something up and they would call it compromise. No, the truth did not come from me. It came from the world doing what the world always does. Paperwork, systems, normal adult processes. An hour later, my realtor texted me a simple message. Deed recorded. The buyer took possession. Keys delivered. I stared at that message until the words blurred. Not because I regretted it, but because it was real. Final. A clean cut. Then my phone rang again, and this time I answered. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew if I did not, they would keep escalating. They would call the police. They would call lawyers. Dad would bang on doors. Rachel would break apart. Mark would snap. And if I was going to step out of my family's script, I needed to speak one clear sentence and then stop. I answered Dad's call. I did not say hello. Dad's voice exploded through the speaker, loud and furious, like he had been holding it in for an hour and it had finally found a target. "Where are you?" "Open this door right now. The truck is here. The kids are here. You are embarrassing your sister." I listened until he ran out of breath. Then I spoke quietly. Dad, I said the house is not available. It is not mine anymore. There was a pause so complete it sounded like the world had shut off. What are you talking about? He finally said. Slower now, like he had not heard me correctly. I repeated it still calm. I sold it. Rachel's voice in the background sharp and panicked. What? What do you mean you sold it? Claire stops. Dad's breathing turned heavy. You cannot do that, he said, like he was stating a law of physics. I already did, I said. Mark spoke for the first time, his voice low, stunned. When? How? I did not explain the timeline. I did not justify myself. I did not list reasons. I kept my voice steady. There was never a signed agreement. There was never a commitment. I did not take anyone's money. I did not promise anyone this house. You all made plans without me. I am done. Rachel started crying. I could hear it in the background. The ugly kind of crying that comes when the floor drops out. Dad's voice turned dangerous. Quiet in a way that meant he was trying to regain control. You did this to punish us. I swallowed hard. My throat felt raw, but my words still came out clear. I did it to save myself. Another long pause, and in that silence, I could hear the sounds around them. The distant beeping of the moving truck. The muffled voice of the driver asking what is happening. A child whining. A car passing by slowly. Reality pressing in. Dad spoke again, but he sounded different. Not angry. Not loud. Just flat. Where are we supposed to go? The question made my chest tighten. Not because I owed him an answer, but because it revealed exactly what I had always been to them. Not a daughter. Not a sister. A solution. I did not answer. I did not offer options. I did not offer money. I did not offer my apartment couch. I let the silence sit there because it was the truth. Rachel made a choke sound, and I heard Mark murmur something to her, probably trying to calm her down, probably trying to figure out the next step. Denise said something faint in the background, a fake soothing comment that sounded like she was already forming a story to tell someone later. Dad did not speak for a few seconds, and then finally he said my name again, but this time it was almost a whisper. Claire. I waited. He did not apologize. He did not ask why. He did not say he understood. He just went quiet, and in that quiet, I could almost see him standing in that driveway, staring at a house he had treated like his, realizing it was a house that belonged to a stranger now. The porch was no longer a stage for his authority, the door that would never open for him no matter how hard he pulled. The silence stretched heavy and ugly and honest. Then Dad hung up. I sat there with my phone in my hand, listening to the empty apartment around me. My coffee had gone cold. My heart was beating slowly like it was finally learning a new rhythm. Outside somewhere in Willow Ridge, a moving truck would be pulling away. People would be standing on the sidewalk stunned. Neighbors would be whispering. My sister would be crying. My dad would be staring at nothing, considering it was the first time in his life that his plan had ended without his permission. And I stayed where I was breathing, letting the quiet settle in, because I knew the hardest part was not what I had done. It was what came after, when the noise stopped, and everyone had to live with the choices they made. I did not hear from Dad for 2 full days. That alone told me more than any angry voicemail ever could. Dad was the kind of man who loved the last word. He loved closing a conversation like a door firm and final, with everyone else standing on the other side. So if he was silent, it meant he did not have a door to slam. Rachel tried first. She sent me a long text that started with disbelief, then shifted into blame, then softened into pleading. She wrote that the kids had been excited. She wrote that Mark was furious. She wrote that Dad was embarrassed and that Mom was barely speaking. Then she wrote the line I expected. We had nowhere else to go. I stared at it for a long time. I did not reply. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I was done being the only adult in a room full of people who thought consequences were optional. A week later, I got the update from my cousin, the one person in my extended family who still spoke to me without an agenda. She did not send gossip. She sent facts the way you might report the weather. Rachel and Mark had moved back into Dad and Mom's house. Not temporarily the way families like ours always said, but in a way that already had roots. Their townhouse was gone. Their money was gone too, mostly swallowed, by what they still owed fees, repairs, and the reality that selling a home does not turn into a neat pile of cash, like people imagine. Rachel had called it just enough for renovations. But in real life, it had been just enough to disappear. Mark had picked up extra hours at work. Rachel had started talking about finding something part-time. The kids were squeezed into a room that used to be Dad's home office. Dad had moved his desk into the dining room, grumbling every time he had to clear papers off the table for dinner. And Dad apparently had not stopped grumbling. He complained about the noise, about the toys on the floor, about the grocery bill, about the fact that the house was never quiet anymore. The irony was sharp enough to cut. Dad had wanted my house because it was quiet and clean and new. He wanted it because it looked like success. He wanted it because it could hold his idea of a family legacy without showing the cracks in the foundation. Now he had his legacy. In his own living room, on his own couch, eating his own food, listening to kids argue over cartoons while Mark paced the hallway talking to his boss on speakerphone. And he had no one to hand the bill to. Mom, from what I heard, stayed the same. Quiet, helpful. Exhausted in a way nobody acknowledged. She cooked, she cleaned. She kept the wheels from falling off like she always had. Part of me wanted to call her. Not to apologize, but to say I saw her. That I always had. That I knew what it cost her to live in Dad's shadow. But I knew what would happen if I opened that door. Mom would cry softly, and then she would say she understood. And then she would ask if I could please just talk to Dad, because he is struggling and Rachel is stressed and the kids miss their aunt. Even Mom's love came with a request attached. So I kept my distance. Not with anger, with intention. The first time Dad called me again was late on a Sunday night. I almost did not answer. My thumb hovered over the screen, the old instinct flaring up, the habit of bracing for impact. But I answered because I wanted to hear it. Not his rage, his reality. His voice was lower than usual, rougher. "Claire," he said. That was it. No lecture, no accusation, no demand. I waited. He exhaled like he was trying to steady himself. "Your sister is having a hard time," he finally said. I did not respond right away. I listened for what was underneath his words, because with Dad, there was always something underneath. He continued. "Mark is stressed. They are talking about renting again, but rent is insane. And with interest rates right now, they cannot buy anything decent. Not without a down payment they do not have. Rachel keeps saying they just need time, but time does not pay bills." There it was. The truth he could not say directly. Dad had thought your house would solve this. He had gambled with my life to protect his sense of control. And when the gamble failed, the problem did not vanish. It landed back in his lap, heavy and real. I kept my voice calm. "Dad, I said I am sorry they are struggling, but I am not the solution." There was a pause, and then I heard something I almost never heard from him. Not an apology, not exactly, just a thin, weary honesty. "I did not think you would actually do it," he said. "I thought you would cave." My chest tightened, because that sentence carried decades inside it. Years of being expected to bend. Years of my choices were treated like they were temporary, until Dad had an opinion. I swallowed. "That was the problem," I said softly. "You should not have assumed you could decide what I would accept." He did not argue. He did not explode. He just went quiet again. Then he said something that surprised me, not because it was warm, but because it was small. It was a nice house. I almost laughed, but it came out as a breath. "It was," I said. We sat in silence for a few seconds. Dad cleared his throat. "So what now?" he asked. I looked around my apartment, at the boxes that were starting to stack up in the corner. I had begun packing quietly, piece by piece. Not because I was running, but because my life was moving forward. I had accepted the promotion track at work. Not a promise, not a fantasy, but a real path with dates and signatures and paperwork. The kind of thing you build when you finally stop dragging other people behind. I am leaving the state, I told him. He made a sound, half frustration, half disbelief. "Of course you are." I did not take the bait. "I have an opportunity," I said, "and I am taking it." He did not ask where. He did not ask when. He did not ask if I was scared. Dad did not tender. But his voice changed slightly, like something had been chipped loose inside him. "You always were the one who could make things happen," he said. I did not let that sentence feel like praise, because in our family that sentence had always been an excuse. "You always can, so you should." I am making things happen for myself now, I said. When we hung up, my hands were shaking, not because I regretted what I had done, but because the weight of it finally hit me. The truth is, leaving did not feel like victory in the way revenge stories sometimes do. It felt like a release, like stepping out of a room where you have been holding your breath for years and realizing you can breathe normally again. I moved quickly after that. I found a new place in a different state, closer to a regional office where my work would be based before the international relocation. I kept the details quiet. I did not post about it. I did not announce it. I did not offer my address to the family grapevine. I told my cousin because she had earned my trust. I told one close friend because she had held me upright when my family tried to knock me down. And that was it. The rest of the family found out the way they always did. Late, secondhand. Too late to interfere. Rachel sent another message when she heard, "So you are really leaving us." I stared at it, feeling the familiar tug of guilt, the old programming that told me love meant sacrifice. Then I typed back one sentence. "I am leaving the role you assigned me, not you." She did not reply. In the months that followed, I heard small echoes of change. The kind that happens when people are forced to live without their favorite scapegoat. Rachel and Mark fought more because stress reveals what love tries to hide. Dad got quieter because his authority did not work the same when he could not threaten me with disappointment. Mom started visiting her sister more just to get out of the house, just to breathe because the home had turned into a crowded pressure cooker. And me. I built a life that was mine. I started sleeping through the night. I started eating dinner at a normal hour instead of grabbing whatever was closest while answering family texts. I started making decisions without checking how they would land in Dad's mind. First, some nights I still felt the ache because freedom does not erase history. It just gives you space to finally feel it. But most days I felt something stronger than ache. Peace. A quiet kind of pride. Not pride in what I took from them, but pride in what I kept for myself. People talk about family like it is always supposed to be safe. Like blood automatically means loyalty. Like love automatically means respect. But in some families, love is used like a leash. Safety is conditional. And respect is something you are expected to earn by giving pieces of yourself away. I spent too many years believing that if I just tried harder, Dad would finally see me as more than a resource. That if I just stayed reasonable, Rachel would stop taking my stability for granted. That if I stayed quiet, Mom's silence would somehow turn into protection. It did not. What changed my life was not yelling, not proving them wrong in a dramatic scene, not winning an argument. What changed my life was stepping back and refusing to be managed. I did not destroy them. They did that to themselves. The moment they decided my peace was less important than their convenience. And I did not lose my family the way Dad threatened I would. I lost a job description. I stopped being the person they could count on to solve their messes. And what I gained was a life that finally belonged to me. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.